Hello, my name is John McReel, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how we can inject Chickering's 7 vectors of student development into recruitment. My hope is that throughout this short presentation, we can begin a dialogue about how we can directly apply student development theory to the college admissions process. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for this because any time that we are working with a student, whether it is in the recruitment process, whether it's when they're officially on campus or at any juncture in their life, we should be giving some amount of respect to the fact that the student is going to be developing and learning the entire way through. And as I've thought on Chickering's 7 vectors, I've really come to believe that all of what we know now as student development theory really rests within those 7 vectors that he created back in the 60s and has since worked to revise going forward. Associated with this, there's also a great annotated bibliography with some direct applications as well as some bending and flexing of these vectors into other arenas, including race and living learning communities, diversity, gender identity, all sorts of different arenas. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well, because it will be a nice pairing with this conversation. One of the things that stuck out to me as I was reviewing and learning about these 7 vectors is that there seemed to be this catalyst moment that had to come into play in order for a student to develop. And while it wasn't strictly labeled as catalyst moment in the research or anything, that's kind of what I've chosen to call it. And I do think that the college search is one of those catalyst moments that really allows for a student to develop because they are pushed to develop through this uncomfortable process of figuring out what the next section of their life is going to look like. This is really the first adult decision that students get to make. And you'll hear me say this again later too, but it's a terrifyingly exciting moment. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit here. And through this catalyst moment of searching for the right college to attend, students can really start to define who they are when it comes to identity and their own personal development. The first vector that Chickering talks about is developing competence. And a quick overview, and this is how things will go. I'll do a quick overview of the theory and then how we can put this into practice. It talks about intellectual competence, so gaining more knowledge, social and interpersonal competence, gaining that relational aspect with other people and starting to rely on some others, but still having their own autonomy, and then physical and manual competence. The 2 parts of this vector that I think are most applicable to the college recruitment process are going to be those first 2, the intellectual competence and the social and interpersonal competence portions. And when it comes to critical thinking, that's where the intellectual competence can really begin to develop. And within the college admissions process, there's a few ways that we can really define this for students. When we're talking about what they're interested in studying, if we pose questions in a critical fashion and ask questions along the lines of what sort of skills do you have? How do those relate to your major or majors of interest? And what other opportunities are you going to seek while you're in college, whether that be study abroad or clubs or organizations or anything along those lines? We can begin to plant the seeds of this development within this process. And those critical thinking skills are going to serve students very well when they're at the university and working towards their degree program, as well as working towards an identity of self. The other big thing, in looking at the interpersonal competence part of this vector, is the relationship that they can develop with their school counselor and with their admission counselor, and knowing that that is an adult relationship that they're going to have moving forward. Some areas where I think this can be easily put into practice for us is through the admissions interview, as well as that continual development of relationship that we have with prospective students while they're engaged in this process. Another important thing to do is to reinforce a student as they're thinking about these different things. And they come to us and say, hey, I've really been thinking about the fact that I am great with numbers and I enjoy data. So I want to look at I want to look at actuarial sciences. That's great. You've identified an area where you are knowledgeable and you're looking at a major that's directly applicable for that. The second vector is managing emotions. I mentioned earlier about things being terribly exciting, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. And within managing emotions, there's going to be the opportunity to identify the strong emotions that students are having within this process. Students also look to broaden their emotional range as they're working on this vector, as well as potentially they're looking at team building or leading, as well as teamwork opportunities within that experience. Within practice, I think one of the things that we need to do is acknowledge the emotions that students are going through. A guy I know pretty well by the name of Jeremy Tiers, he's an admissions professional, and he always says, ask them what they're afraid of. Just go for it and ask them what their fears are. Because as I mentioned, this is a terribly exciting experience. What I mean by that is it is a fair amount of terrifying and a great deal of excitement surrounding this process for students. Because like I mentioned before, it is the first chance a student really gets to make that adult decision. And there's a few ways that we can help students within this process of recruitment help develop along these vectors by asking those questions about what gives them a little bit of pause for concern, makes them a little bit fearful during the interview, as well as working on that throughout the entire cycle. So if a student is willing to share that information to you, hey, I'm concerned about being too far away from home, we can talk about ways to overcome that. And by making that direct connection to their fear and their concern, we can abate that fear and make sure that they are going to have the opportunity to move forward and progress. There's a fantasy book that I love that talks about the power of names, and that always sticks in my mind as well. That being able to name something and identify it is crucial to being able to understand it. And so if we can name the emotions and understand the emotions, we're going to have some success there. The next one is moving through autonomy towards interdependence. This is when a student's going to disengage a little bit from their parents, but they're also going to discover the importance of others in their life, whether that be through inclusion within a group or the respect that they can gain through their peers, or finding that great mentor-mentee relationship, whether that be with a faculty member or someone else that they value. And they start to gain a little bit of freedom from a continual need for reassurance. It's still going to continue to go on. And it's, I've mentioned a few times already that if we can reassure students in this process, they'll be more likely to enroll as well. In practice, there's going to be conflict with stakeholders, so trying to manage that relationship between them and their parents is important. You can begin the idea of career planning and saying, all right, what are you looking at for a career in the long term? As well as having that concrete discussion about determining fit, and especially financial fit. What makes sense longevity-wise when it comes to college. Understanding the resources that are available, which can help them guide towards exploring their future environment. So especially when it comes to the campus visit, talking with academic advisors and making those concrete connections to those resources on campus is going to be a vital way for us to help students move through autonomy and towards interdependence. And also developing mature interpersonal relationships. The rapport that a student can build with their school counselor, with their admission counselor, as well as the conduit that we can be to developing those relationships with other people on campus is vital, because this is a point where students are going to learn and see that individuals are equals. All right, but that's going to start with being based on trust and communication. And we start to model some of that within what we do, especially building trust through follow through. When we say we're going to have, an agenda to them by a certain point, make sure it's there. Make sure that we're following through, we're delivering on that, because we're modeling that relationship that they can have with future students, as well as to continue to just encourage that discussion of emotions and points of view, especially as students begin to discover and have an appreciation for diversity of opinions. This is going to be huge, because they'll be able to accept and be understanding of opinions that are different from their own. Through that acceptance, that they can find within the process. And within the admission process overall, we can make sure that we're having those concrete discussions about what that will look like and how they will be challenged, again, in this catalyst moment that's coming through. The next one, and a lot of these kind of build towards establishing that identity for a student. And during this point, they're going to clarify their needs and identify their needs, develop grounding principles that will guide them moving forward. So trying to kind of go past their parents and see what those, what that self-discovery looks like and what those moral guidelines are, as well as understanding who they are personally. And in this, we can use the act of determining college fit as a self-discovery tool. What are the things that they want to accomplish? What are the things that are going to make them who they are and who they're going to be? We can also emphasize this in the application process by ensuring that community service is a component of that, because that's a great tool of self-discovery, as well as, again, using probing questions to guide that conversation around determining college fit. Establishing purpose, who am I, who will I be, and this has been updated a little bit, knowing that students aren't going to have just one job their entire life. They're going to have multiple jobs. But what's the common thread? What's going to allow them to persist and enjoy the work that they are doing? And relating that to specific majors. And students can create that sense of purpose, who they are for themselves. Whether they're going into a career for an altruistic, financial, or other reasons, they're creating that purpose. And that self-discovery, that career discovery, and the skills conversation that we have throughout the entire course of the life cycle of recruitment, we can really help develop a student find that purpose and say, yeah, you have a passion for working with other students. Here's a lot of careers you can look at, and here's the common thread between all of them. And the last vector is really developing that integrity that a student is going to have throughout this process. The moral and ethical responsibility, discovering the gray areas that exist, as well as codifying their morals, their ethical framework through their actions. And again, we can do this in a couple of different ways. Again, through finding an institution that also fits their morality, and acknowledging with students that their morality may shift while they're in college, that they're going to have to be willing to push beyond the bounds of their parents, which doubles back on some of the other vectors that we've talked about. As well as those moral and ethical decisions. What is the purpose of their career? What is going to be the keystone for them as they're moving through their life's work? And finally, at a very baseline, understanding the cost of attendance and the cost of their education and what that's going to look like when they have to enter repayment and things along those lines. So you can develop the integrity and the empathy and the respect and balance it with that responsibility of self-confidence and their focus on the world and their courage and everything along those lines. And in conclusion, there's a great many ways that these vectors of recruitment, as I'm going to start to call them, can be put into practice through the campus visit and establishing those connections on campus and helping them identify their fit and having those conversations about costs that can really help them figure out what is going to be the best choice for them and what's the integrity decision they can make there. Through the admissions interview, helping them find their identity and touching on those first four vectors that we talked about with, developing competence, managing emotion, moving through autonomy towards interdependence, as well as developing those mature and independent interpersonal relationships that can help a student really figure out who they are. We can also highlight a lot of these qualities within the admissions application process. And most importantly, building the trust and rapport of relationships with the student and between them and us, as well as them and their school counselor and other stakeholders that are going to be involved in that process. And that is really going to be the key thing that can build, and those are kind of the four key areas within the recruitment process. And I think these vectors can really help us define, distinguish, and create a good opportunity for our students to develop, as well as find that right fit institution for themselves.